Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story that will absolutely blow your mind. You're a Roman woman who just discovered your husband is cheating on you, you're furious, heartbroken, and you want out of this marriage immediately. So you march up to him and say, I divorce you. But instead of freedom, you get absolutely nothing. Because in ancient Rome, those three little words could only be spoken by one person, and it definitely wasn't you. If your husband got tired of the way you chewed your food, he could literally kick you out of the house, take your children, and marry someone else by sunset. This wasn't some rare occurrence. This was a law for over 1,000 years, affecting millions of women who had zero legal power to escape, no matter how miserable their lives became. Before we dive into this mind-blowing journey together, I'd really love it if you could hit that subscribe button and drop a like on this video, but only if it genuinely speaks to you. I'm also super curious. Where in the world are you listening to this right now? Are you cozy in bed, maybe sipping some chamomile tea, or are you one of those brave souls taking a midnight walk? Leave me a comment and let me know your story. I genuinely read every single one, and they always make my day. Now, let's dim those lights, get really comfortable, and travel back 2,000 years to uncover one of history's most shocking double standards. Picture yourself walking through the streets of Rome in the year 50 AD. The city is absolutely magnificent. Gleaming marble temples stretching toward the heavens, bustling markets overflowing with silks from China and spices from India. And everywhere you look, there are these incredibly wealthy Romans strutting around in their pristine white togas, looking like they own the world, But here's the thing that would absolutely horrify any modern person. Beneath all this stunning architecture and impressive wealth, there was a secret so dark, so unfair that it's almost hard to believe it was real. No matter how smart, rich, or well-connected they were, had about as much say in their marriages as a piece of furniture. Let me tell you about a woman named Tullia. She was the daughter of Marcus Tullius Cicero. That's Cicero, one of Rome's greatest orators and philosophers. You'd think being the daughter of such an influential man would give her some protection, some power over her own life, right? When Tullia was just 16, her father arranged her first marriage to a young man named Gaius Piso. But that wasn't really the point. Roman marriages weren't about love. They were about creating political alliances and combining family fortunes. Tullia did her duty, played the perfect wife, and then tragedy struck. Piso died young. So what happened next? Did Tullia get to grieve? Maybe take some time to figure out what she wanted? Cicero had arranged her second marriage to a man named Furius Craspes. Tullia had no choice in the matter. She was essentially traded from one family to another like a valuable commodity. But here's where the story gets really heartbreaking. After several years with Craspes, Tullia fell deeply in love with a charming young man named Dolabella. For the first time in her life, she experienced real, genuine romantic love. She was already married. There was only one way out of marriage. Her husband had to divorce her. Tullia did something incredibly brave and incredibly risky. She convinced her father to pressure Craspes into divorcing her so she could marry Dolabella, but only because the men in her life agreed to it. Tullia herself had no legal power to make it happen. Now, here's the really twisted part. If Craspes had decided he wanted to keep Tullia as his wife, there would have been absolutely nothing she could do about it. Even if she was even if she was miserable, even if Craspes was the worst husband in the world, she would have been stuck for life. The Roman legal system had a term for this one-sided divorce process. They called it repudium, and it was brutally simple. A Roman husband could end his marriage by saying just 3 words, tua's residential tibia bido, which basically means take your things and go. Often this was shortened to simply stating repudio, no paperwork, no lawyers, no lengthy court proceedings. Just a few words in a woman's entire life could be turned upside down in an instant. A man didn't even need a reason. He could divorce his wife because she burned dinner, because she talked too much, because she didn't talk enough, because she was too tall, too short, too young, too old, or simply because he woke up on a Tuesday and felt like starting fresh with someone new. The Roman writer Juvenal, who was basically the ancient world's version of a stand-up comedian, once wrote about a man who went through 6 wives in 5 years, not because they cheated on him or treated him badly, but because he had the attention span of a goldfish when it came to marriage. One wife got the boot because she had a cold and her sneezing annoyed him. Another was dismissed because, and I'm not making this up, she was too fond of bathing. Good hygiene was a deal breaker for this particular Roman gentleman. But while men could divorce for literally any reason under the sun, women were completely powerless. even if their husbands were violent, unfaithful, or completely irresponsible. Women had no legal way to escape. The idea of a woman initiating a divorce was so foreign to Roman thinking that they didn't even have legal procedures for it. Let me paint you a picture of just how unfair this system was. Imagine you're a Roman woman married to a man who beats you every day. He gambles away your family's money, brings other women into your home, and treats you like dirt. You call a lawyer, file for divorce, and get out of there as fast as possible. But in ancient Rome, you have to smile, endure it, and hope that maybe, just maybe, your husband would eventually get bored enough to divorce you. The psychological torture this must have created is almost unimaginable. Picture living every single day knowing that your husband holds all the power, that he could destroy your life with a few words, and that you have absolutely no recourse if he decides to exercise that power. And here's what makes it even more infuriating. Roman women weren't helpless or stupid. They were often incredibly intelligent, well-educated, and influential behind the scenes. The wife of Emperor Augustus. This woman was brilliant. She advised emperors, shaped political policies, and was arguably one of the most powerful people in the entire Roman Empire. Even she, with all her intelligence and influence, had no legal right to divorce her husband if she chose to. Roman women could memorize entire epic poems, speak multiple languages, manage vast household budgets, and host dinner parties for hundreds of guests. But they couldn't legally end a marriage to a man. The contradiction is absolutely mind-boggling. You might be wondering how the Romans possibly justified this incredibly unfair system. Well, they had their reasons. Roman men argued that giving women the power to divorce would create chaos in society, believed that marriage was too important to the political and economic structure of the empire to let emotions get in the way. Roman marriages weren't really about the happiness of the people involved. They were about creating strategic alliances between powerful families. If a senator's daughter could divorce his son-in-law whenever she felt like it might mess up carefully planned political arrangements. And we certainly couldn't have that, could we? This logic completely ignored the chaos and misery it created in women's lives. But in a society where women couldn't vote, couldn't own property independently, and couldn't even leave their houses without permission, their personal happiness wasn't exactly a top priority. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this entire system was what happened to the children. When a Roman man divorced his wife, the children automatically stayed with him. No exceptions. A mother could kiss her babies goodnight and wake up the next morning to discover she'd never see them again. Think about that for a moment. Imagine you spent years raising your children, nursing them through illnesses, teaching them to walk and talk, and then one day your husband decides he wants a younger wife. Not only do you lose your home and your social status, but you also lose your children, the people you love most in the world. This wasn't some rare tragedy that happened occasionally. This was standard operating procedure that destroyed countless mothers' lives throughout Roman history. Women would be forced to walk away from their children, knowing they had no legal right to see them, visit them, or even know how they were doing. Yet, despite this incredibly oppressive system, some Roman women found ways to fight back. They developed clever strategies to protect themselves, found loopholes in laws, and sometimes even managed to turn the tables on their husbands. These stories of resistance and rebellion are absolutely fascinating and show us that the human spirit simply refuses to be crushed, no matter how unfair the circumstances. What exactly was Roman marriage if it wasn't about love? Prepare yourself for this revelation. Roman marriage was essentially a sophisticated business merger wrapped up in fancy ceremonies and expensive jewelry. I'm not exaggerating here. The Romans literally had a phrase for it, which comes from mater meaning mother and monia meaning duty or obligation. So right there in the name, they're telling you that marriage was a woman's duty, not a partnership between equals. Let me tell you about one of the most shocking business deals disguised as a wedding in Roman history. It's 59 BC and Julius Caesar, the Julius Caesar, needs to strengthen his political alliance with Pompey the Great. These two men are essentially trying to divide up the Roman world between them, but they need to trust each other. So what does Caesar do? He offers Pompey his only daughter, Julia, as a wife. Now here's where it gets really twisted. Julia was already engaged to someone else, a young man named Servilius Caepio, who she actually loved. But Caesar didn't care about his daughter's feelings. He broke off her engagement without even consulting her and handed her over to Pompey like a piece of property. Julia went from being engaged to a man her own age who she cared about to being married to a man who was literally older than her father. And the most heartbreaking part? by all historical accounts. Julia was actually happy with Pompey. She fell in love with him, and they had a good marriage. But that was pure luck, not design. Caesar had no idea whether they'd be compatible. He was just making a political calculation. But here's what really blows my mind about this whole transaction. At the exact same time Caesar was giving his daughter to Pompey, he was also arranging to marry Pompey's daughter, Pompeia, to strengthen the alliance even further. Except there was one tiny problem. Caesar was already married, named Pompeia Sulla. He divorced her instantly to make room for the new political arrangement. This wasn't unusual. This was Tuesday in ancient Rome. Marriage was seen as such a flexible business tool that men would divorce and remarry multiple times throughout their lives, treating wives like interchangeable parts in their political machines. Let me give you another example that perfectly illustrates how transactional these marriages were. There was a Roman senator named Marcus Crassus, one of the richest men who ever lived, who literally used marriages like most people use credit cards. He had a son named Publius, and when Crassus wanted to form an alliance with Julius Caesar, he married Publius off to Caesar's grandniece. But here's the kicker. When that political alliance was no longer useful, Crassus immediately started shopping around for a better marriage for his son. He didn't care that Publius was happy with his wife or that they had children together. The marriage had served its political purpose, and now it was time for an upgrade. The Romans even had a term for this kind of strategic marriage switching, matrimonium politicum. Wealthy Roman families would sometimes arrange multiple backup marriages for their children just in case the first political alliance didn't work out. Imagine being a young Roman woman and knowing that you're not just married to one man, but you're essentially engaged to 2 or 3 others as backup plans. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but surely some Roman marriages were about love, right? Love could happen, but it was considered a happy accident. The Roman poet Ovid, who was basically the ancient world's relationship guru, wrote extensively about love and marriage. But even he made a clear distinction between amor, passionate love, and matrimonium, the legal institution of marriage. Ovid actually advised young Romans to find love outside of marriage. It is a shameful thing to love one's wife too much. Loving your spouse too much was considered embarrassing and inappropriate. The ideal Roman marriage was supposed to be based on mutual respect and duty. This explains so much about why divorce laws were so one-sided. If marriage is just a business arrangement, then of course the person with more economic and political power should have more control over when to end the contract. From the Roman perspective, giving women equal divorce rights would be like letting the junior partner in a business dissolve the company. But here's where Roman thinking gets really twisted. While they treated marriage as a cold business transaction, they simultaneously expected women to be completely emotionally invested in these arrangements. A Roman wife was supposed to love her husband devotedly, manage his household perfectly, and bear his children with joy, all while knowing that he could discard her at any moment for any reason. The double standard is absolutely mind-boggling. Men were encouraged to view marriage strategically and emotionally detach themselves when necessary. But women, they were expected to pour their hearts and souls into relationships that were fundamentally designed to benefit everyone except them. Let me tell you about a woman who perfectly illustrates this impossible situation. Her name was Octavia Minor, and she was Augustus Caesar's sister. Octavia was married to a man named Gaius Marcellus, and by all accounts, they were genuinely happy together. They had 3 children, and seemed to have one of those rare Roman marriages that actually involved love. But then Augustus decided he needed to strengthen his alliance with Mark Antony, the guy who was having that famous affair with Cleopatra. So Augustus forced Octavia to divorce her beloved husband and marry Antony instead, being a dutiful Roman woman, agreed to sacrifice her happiness for her brother's political ambitions. And here's the really tragic part. Octavia actually tried to make the best of it. She bore Antony 2 daughters and attempted to be a loving, supportive wife. But while she was at home in Rome being the perfect spouse, Antony was in Egypt, living it up with Cleopatra. Eventually, Antony divorced Octavia to officially marry his Egyptian queen. This poor woman lost 2 husbands, one because her brother needed a political alliance, and another because her second husband preferred a more exciting woman. Octavia's feelings, her happiness, her emotional well-being, none of it mattered compared to political and romantic desires of the men in her life. But what makes Octavia's story even more infuriating is how she was praised for it. Roman historians wrote glowingly about her virtue and dignity in accepting these humiliations without complaint. They held her up as the ideal Roman woman, someone who sacrificed everything for male ambition and never made a fuss about it. This is the mindset we're dealing with here. Roman society was set up in such a way that a woman's greatest virtue was her willingness to be treated poorly without objection. The perfect Roman wife was essentially a beautiful, intelligent doormat who could host dinner parties and produce male heirs while smiling through whatever abuse or neglect came her way. And speaking of producing male heirs, that's where things get even more twisted. Roman marriages weren't just business deals. They were also breeding programs designed to create the next generation of Roman citizens. A woman who couldn't have children or who only had daughters was considered defective merchandise. The pressure on Roman women to produce sons was absolutely crushing. The historian Plutarch recorded the story of a woman named Cornelia who was constantly criticized for only having daughters. Her husband's family made her life miserable, suggesting that she was cursed by the gods or that she was somehow deliberately preventing male births. The psychological torture these women endured must have been unbearable, and if a woman was suspected of being infertile, her husband could divorce her immediately without any social stigma. He was often praised for making the practical decision to find a more productive wife. Meanwhile, if a man was infertile, which, let's be honest, was just as likely, the woman was still blamed for the lack of children. This brings us to one of the most shocking aspects of Roman marriage culture, the practice of trial marriages. Wealthy Roman families would sometimes arrange temporary marriages to test a woman's fertility before committing to a permanent arrangement. If she didn't get pregnant within a year or two, the marriage would be dissolved and the woman sent back to her family like a defective product. Can you imagine the emotional trauma of being treated this way? You're married to someone, you try to build a life together, you hope for love and stability, and then you're discarded like yesterday's newspaper because your reproductive system didn't perform on schedule. But here's what's truly mind-blowing about all of this. Despite being treated like breeding stock and business assets, many Roman women still managed to find ways to exert influence and protect themselves within this horrible system. Some became masters of manipulation, others found legal loopholes, and a few even managed to accumulate enough wealth and power to fight back against their oppressors. These women developed survival strategies that were absolutely brilliant, and their stories reveal something incredible about human resilience. But before we explore those tales of rebellion and resistance, we need to understand something that will completely change how you think about Roman society. Not all Roman marriages were created equal. There were actually 3 completely different types of Roman marriage, each with its own rules, its own power dynamics, and its own level of oppression for women. And the type of marriage you had determined not just your legal rights, but whether you had any chance of survival if things went wrong. Here's something that will absolutely blow your mind. The Romans actually had 3 completely different types of marriage. And depending on which type you ended up in, your life could be either slightly miserable or completely hellish. It's like they created a menu of oppression and let families choose their preferred level of female subjugation. The first type was called matrimonium cum manu, which literally means marriage with hand or marriage with power. And trust me, this wasn't about holding hands romantically. This was about a woman literally becoming the legal property of her husband, as if she were a slave or a piece of furniture. When a woman entered a cum manu marriage, she legally ceased to exist as an independent person. Her identity was completely absorbed into her husband's family. Let me tell you the story of a woman named Claudia Pulchra to show you just how devastating this could be. Claudia was born into one of Rome's most prestigious families. The Claudii were basically Roman royalty. Her father was incredibly wealthy, owning vast estates and thousands of slaves. Claudia grew up in luxury, receiving the best education money, but when she married through cum manu at age 16, everything changed overnight. All of her father's wealth that she was supposed to inherit, it now belonged to her husband's family. Her legal connection to her own parents, if her birth family had any legal disputes, she couldn't inherit from them, couldn't represent them in court, couldn't even visit them without her husband's permission. The really twisted part is that Claudia went from being Claudia Pulchra of the noble Claudii family to essentially being Claudia, the property of her husband's household. She kept her first name, but everything else about her identity was erased. It's like she died and was reborn as a completely different person, one with no rights, no inheritance, and no legal connection to her past life. In a cum manu marriage, if Claudia's husband died, she didn't become a free widow. She became the property of her husband's male heir. If her stepson was 20 years old and decided he didn't like her, he could literally sell her to another family or force her into another marriage. A woman in cum manu was never, ever free. But wait, it gets worse. Remember how we talk about Roman men being able to divorce their wives with 3 simple words? In cum manu marriages, it wasn't even called divorce. It was called dismissal, like you dismiss a servant. The husband didn't need to say anything formal. He could literally just point to the door and say, "Get out." The woman had no choice but to leave immediately with nothing but the clothes on her back. The second type of marriage was called matrimonium sine manu, marriage without hand, or marriage without power. This sounds better, right? It was marginally less horrific, but only marginally. In sine manu marriages, women remained legally connected to their birth families rather than being absorbed into their husband's clan. This meant that a woman like our friend Claudia could still inherit from her father and maintain some legal connection to her original family. She wasn't completely erased as a person. And this is a big but, she still had absolutely no power to divorce her husband. She was just slightly less powerless property. The third type was the most unusual and frankly the most bizarre. It was called usus marriage, and it was based on the idea that if a couple lived together for a full year without the woman being absent from the home for more than 3 consecutive nights, they were automatically legally married. You might think this sounds romantic, like ancient Roman common law marriage. But here's the twist that shows you just how obsessed Romans were with controlling women. If a woman wanted to avoid automatically becoming married through usus, she had to leave her partner's home for at least 3 nights every year. This was called pre-nuptial, the 3-night rule. Picture the scenario. You're a Roman woman who's been living happily with a man for 11 months. You've built a life together, but you're not ready for the legal commitment of marriage. Every year you have to pack a bag and leave for 3 nights, like some kind of bizarre relationship reset button. But here's where it gets really twisted. Many families use the pre-nuptial rule. Wealthy fathers would sometimes force their daughters to observe pre-nuptial to prevent usus marriages they didn't approve of. You could have a situation where a woman desperately wanted to marry her partner, but her father would literally have her kidnapped for 3 nights every year to prevent the automatic marriage from taking place. Can you imagine the psychological torture? You're living with someone, but once a year you're forcibly separated to maintain your family's control over your future marriage prospects. It's like being in a relationship that gets legally interrupted by your parents every 12 months. Here's what's really fascinating about these 3 types of marriage. They reveal something crucial about Roman society's attitude toward women. You see, cum manu marriage was a traditional, old-fashioned way of doing things. It was considered the most proper and moral type of marriage because it gave men complete control. But as Rome became more cosmopolitan and wealthy, sine manu marriages became more popular among the upper classes because wealthy families realized that completely transferring their daughters to another family meant losing valuable assets and political connections. Let me tell you about a brilliant woman named Servilia who perfectly illustrates how some families learned to game this system. Servilia was Julius Caesar's longtime mistress, the same Caesar we talked about earlier, and she was also the mother of Brutus, the guy who eventually stabbed Caesar in the back. Servilia was married sine manu, which meant she maintained her connection to her incredibly wealthy and influential birth family. This gave her something that most Roman women never had. When her husband started treating her poorly, she couldn't divorce him, but she could leverage her family's power to make his life very uncomfortable. Servilia used her political connections to influence her husband's business deals, his social standing, and even his political career. She couldn't leave him legally, but she could make him regret treating her badly. It was a form of soft power that women in cum manu marriages could never access. But here's the really clever part. Servilia also used her sine manu status to conduct her affair with Caesar more safely. Because she wasn't completely absorbed into her husband's family, she had more freedom of movement and more legitimate reasons to interact with other powerful men. She turned the slightly less oppressive marriage laws into a shield for her romantic rebellion. We have to be careful not to romanticize any of this. Even in the best type of Roman marriage, sine manu, women still had no legal right to divorce, no control over their children, and very limited freedom. The difference between the 3 types of marriage was really just different degrees of powerlessness. And here's something that will make your blood boil. Roman law specifically stated that the purpose of these different marriage types was to give families more flexibility in managing their female relatives. They literally created a menu of oppression so that families could choose exactly how much legal personhood they wanted to strip away from their daughters. The legal scholar Gaius, writing in the 2nd century AD, explained it this way. The reason for these different types of marriage is to ensure that families can maintain appropriate control over their women while maximizing political and economic advantages. Notice how he doesn't mention anything about the women's happiness, preferences, or well-being. They were just assets to be managed. But perhaps the most shocking thing about these three marriage types is how they were marketed to women themselves. Roman society convinced women that they should be grateful for whichever type of marriage they received, because at least they were getting married at all. Unmarried women were considered social outcasts, economic burdens, and moral failures. So Roman women were essentially told, you could be completely powerless property, slightly less powerless property, or temporarily powerless property. Pick your poison and say thank you. And yet, despite this incredibly oppressive system, some Roman women found ways to thrive. They developed strategies to accumulate wealth, build political influence, and even protect themselves from abusive husbands. But their methods were often so subtle and clever that most people, including many historians, completely missed them for centuries. These women understood something crucial. If you can't change the game, you have to learn to play it better than anyone else expects. And the stories of how they did this are absolutely incredible. But to understand their strategies, we first need to dive deeper into the most fundamental aspect of Roman marriage law, the concept that shaped everything else and made divorce so brutally one-sided. We need to talk about the paterfamilias system. And trust me, what you're about to learn will explain so much about why Roman society was structured the way it was.